Okay, I think we ought to get started now. People can join us if they're a little late. We don't hold things up. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kiva Wright-Berry, and I want to welcome you to this session. We're going to spend some time talking with our speaker today, Dr. David Childs from Northern Kentucky University. And his topic is Lift Every Voice and Sing, Exploring Black Religious Music as Popular Culture History. Dr. Childs?
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining me. As our presenter, as our moderator pointed out, my topic is on Lift Every Voice and Sing. We know that, of course, is the Black National Anthem. We saw it being performed after Super Bowl. And if you're a football fan, I'm not a huge fan of the sport of football, but I saw that they were giving a nod to us in terms of Black culture. And in many cases, we lift every voice and sing unto the heavens ring. So as you already know, this presentation is performative in order to, in my view, in order to talk about traditional Black religious music, you have to involve some music. I teach at Northern Kentucky University, which is right on the border of Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, where I'm also a pastor as well. So within that whole tradition. But in my classes, I teach history, but I also teach history teachers, social studies education majors. And one of the things I always share with them is that you should incorporate the arts into your teaching. Well, whether it is some aspect of the visual arts. So if we're doing African American history, we can incorporate the Harlem Renaissance and those painters and visual artists of that time. We can bring in poetry, we can bring in sculpture, theater, and also music in order to teach history and understand history, to understand culture. And that's really what this is about. This comes from my role and my training as a historian, as a history teacher, to talk about African American history from a musical perspective. So that gives us an idea of where we'll be going with this. You see an image of Aretha Franklin. She began her singing in the Black church. And if you have not seen the new documentary that they did, or the biopic, I believe it's called Amazing Grace, and it shows how her whole relationship with the church. Her father was a minister, the Reverend C.L. Franklin. And if you haven't heard Aretha's gospel album, we really are missing the whole aspect of Aretha Franklin. But it's very much a part of the Black church tradition, the historic, the study of African American history is should also be a study of music. Now, let me know when I transition. Can you see my slide transitions? Because sometimes it doesn't work out too well. Can you see that transition? Are you seeing the next slide? Perfect. My story and roots in the historic Black church and music tradition. In graduate school, we talked about researching and writing autobiographically. And those that have studied that genre, that philosophical tool, is really a methodology. And it calls for one to unapologetically bring oneself into your writing and your research. That is, bring who you are into your research. Traditionally, the Western researcher wanted to hide their identity and be completely objective. But as time goes on, the newer scholars begin to say one cannot ever be completely objective, there is some subjectivity involved when we read, when we write, when we teach. And so when we people like Lisa Delpit talked about, when we write autobiographically, we put ourselves into it. And this work is, for me, it's autobiographical in a lot of different ways. For one, I grew up in a traditional Black church. Now, we mean Black church in a general sense. You know, we know that every Black church is not the same, but at the same time, as a Black church study scholar, theologian, trained as a historian, I noticed that whether you are in the Baptist tradition, Church of God in Christ, the African Methodist Episcopal, even Black Catholics, there's a lot of similarities in the way that the liturgy is manifested, in the way people experience worship. And a big part of that is the singing and the music. And so even in my own home, my dad was a pastor. I come from a long line of ministers. And we stand in that tradition of people like Dr. King, the great Howard Thurman, even Malcolm X, the Black preachers, the historic Black preachers, going back to David Walker from the 1820s, Frederick Douglass. This is a part of and Cornel West says that the Black church is a part of, should be a part of thought of as a part of the African American intellectual tradition. But even at home, we sang and danced. It's a part of who we are. It's a part of our ontology. And that's the study of existence and who we are. And we said things like, Jesus is on the main line. Tell him what you want. This is a traditional African American song. Jesus is on the main line. Tell him what you want. Jesus is on the main line. Tell him what you want. Call him up and tell him what you want. If you want your body healed, tell him what you want. If you want your body healed, tell him what you want. If you want your body healed, tell him what you want. Call him up and tell him what you want. It's a part of, and it's not necessarily a performance, but the secular and the sacred are blended in African American tradition. As I get into some of the philosophical underpinnings of this work, I'll get more into that. But the song is expression, it's self-expression, it's emotional. It comes out of that religious tradition of struggle, the theology of suffering, and it's expressive. And there are groanings that cannot be uttered within the normal discourse, so it must be sung out. And another traditional song is, I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready. Walk in Jerusalem just like John. Oh, John, what will you say? Walk in Jerusalem just like John. I'll be there on the coming day. Walk in Jerusalem just like John. I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready. Walk in Jerusalem just like John. These songs are often difficult to date. Some would put them in the early 1800s, and some of these songs originate from the 1700s. They always had that esoteric, apocalyptic theme. This song here is reminiscent of John the Revelator. They sung a lot about John the Revelator, the writer of the book of Revelations in African tradition. The presentation will examine the historic religious songs during the antebellum times. And when you see antebellum, we mean before the Civil War, through the Civil Rights Movement, and ultimately discuss contemporary presence meaningfulness and youthfulness in the Black community. And you've already seen we've been doing that in terms of the music is a part of who African Americans are. It's the embodiment of the Black experience. And the thesis is, although many elements make up so-called Black culture in history and in modern times, religious expression and Black sacred music have made up a significant part of what it means to be Black in the lives of many people. Not as a whole, and we're talking traditional African American culture. You can sort of say different things now in the 21st century as the African American culture has become more fragmented. But by and large, African Americans remain the most religious individuals in the U.S. And this sacred music, even those that don't identify as being religious, they can identify with sacred Black religious music. My first point, I want to get into a philosophical and conceptual framework, talk about my conceptual framework, and maybe even give you some readings to do. I wanted to include these individuals: Sojourner Truth, Douglass, Dr. King, icons in African American history, because they're all a part of this religious tradition as well. But let's get into some philosophical and conceptual framework. So Cornel West, prophetic pragmatism. I'm going to toggle back and forth here. Cornel West, in his book from the 80s called Prophesied Deliverance, and Afro-American Revolutionary Christianity. I use this work in my research, and some of this work comes out of my doctoral thesis. And he talked about this prophetic Christianity. And as I was thinking through his work and reading through it, my mind was stuck on prophecy, and I couldn't quite understand what he meant. How is he thinking about the word prophecy as it relates to the historic Black culture, the historic Black church? And what we have to understand is when he says prophecy, those in this tradition, they mean speaking to the now, speaking to the situation of the Black experience right now in the present, and also forward looking. And I think that's so powerful. It's a prophetic Christianity, so it can speak to the homelessness in the Black community, the economic injustice, the systemic racism that plagues the Black experience, the addiction, the lack of educational opportunities, the lack of resources, the lack of food, all of these things that must be dealt with in any serious religious treatment of African Americans must look at the here and now. So it's prophetic. It speaks to the now, must address that, but it's also forward looking, going forward. Soon and very soon, we are going to see the King. It's a song of hope. Soon and very soon, we are going to see the King. Oh, soon and very soon, we are going to see the King. Hallelujah, hallelujah, we're going to see the King. So a lot of the songs were forward-looking in that sense of prophecy, and they spoke to life in the hereafter. Dr. West talks about an Afro-American revolutionary Christianity. And so it is, he's not afraid, he's unapologetic about challenging a hegemonic system, a government system that's racist, or borrowing from critical race theory, a system that's inherently racist, a legal system that's designed to disenfranchise, to disempower people of color. And so this informs my work. Another individual I use is Albert Roboteau. He just passed. He's out of Princeton. And his book, Slavery, Religion, the Invisible Institution. And one of the things he says is that the Black experience offers a more authentic Christianity because it was forged in suffering. And there's a scripture that talks about the furnace of affliction. And David said, I was shapen in iniquity, and the sin that my mother conceived me. So we were forged in the fire of suffering. And Roberto argues that that makes a more authentic godliness, a more authentic religious tradition. And thus, you feel it when you sing it. It's like James Brown. James Brown was influenced by the Black church. I was talking to my good friend from the Smithsonian, Dr. Eric Williams, and he talked about how you can see that Black spirituality even in James Brown singing. This is a man's world, and he's crying. This is a man's world, and he breaks down in tears. That's often that's very much traditional Black singing. We're not afraid to show emotion. In traditional Western performance, they're very reserved. That's a very Eurocentric idea, to be reserved and not show emotions. And in fact, they think sometimes Black religious music is unseemly because we're crying and shouting and expressing ourselves. Self-expression is often frowned upon in Western culture. And so it's in conflict. So it finds the Black religious expression in conflict. But I love Roberto's work because he talks about that authentic Christianity. And he uses the notion, the invisible institution. It's an institution within the institution. So the Black religious experience, the Black church, especially in antebellum times, was an invisible institution operating simultaneously as the racist white church, white institution. And so often slaves had to, in secret, express themselves, find religious expression um, in the furnace of affliction. So this book is very powerful. And so I use his work as well. James Cone, primarily my work comes out of what really leads to Roberto and Cone. His Black theology in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, was really spoke to the sentiments of my heart. See, I grew up in the inner city, and I spent some time homeless, actually. Even as a young adult, I didn't come from money. And so a lot of these readings, it took me a while to come around to. And later on, it's almost like letting something marinate. Like my wife, when she makes crab legs, she makes this gumbo sauce, and she lets it marinate all day. You don't even need butter. It'd be like that thing be, as my kids say, popping or busting. And that's how these ideas are for me. The cross and the lynching tree spoke to me because it takes the notion of suffering, the religious idea of suffering on the tree. Enslaved Blacks identified with Christ because he suffered. He was one that was innocent, and he wasn't, white like the picture depict. He was a man of color, and he suffered. And this is what Cone gets at. Unjustly, the whole injustice of the Black experience. So it resonated with them when they were able to read it for themselves. And Cone is liking the Black religious experience, the lynching, the legacy of lynching in the South, those counties in the Deep South that were they terrorized African Americans with the lynching tree. And they controlled the vote, and they controlled politics with the lynching tree. And it reminds me of the Harper Lee text, To Kill a Mockingbird, where a mob comes and unjustly, they raid the jail and unjustly grab a Black man from the jail, and they're going to take so-called justice into their own hands. And they have their Klansman hood on. And they're going to lynch this young Black man. I don't want to give a spoiler. Kind of am. And there's a little girl in the courthouse. in the jail with her dad. Her dad was a lawyer. This is at night. And she recognized the shoes of the Klansmen. She said, "Mr. Smith, is that you?" And they were citizens from everyday life that were a part of the Klan. And that was, for me, that was one of the parts of her book, Harper Lee's book, that stood out to me. But the terror of lynching, the lynching tree, and how the Black religious experience is more authentic because of suffering. And the before I was afflicted, I went astray. There's so much biblical text that deals with the theology of suffering, and it plays out in the religious music. Asante, what I borrow from his work is the idea of Afrocentrism, and with Afrocentrism, Afrocentric epistemology, that's the philosophical branch of the study of knowledge. Whose knowledge are we learning? Different competing knowledges. And the Afrocentric epistemology says that there's an African way of looking at things, an African way of knowing. And one of the things that's very African is singing and self-expression through music. So that's a little bit about the philosophical foundation. That's Malifi Asante's book. It should not be an H there. It's Asante, Afrocentric epistemology. And nowadays people are saying Afrocentric. They're taking the O out of it, more authentic spelling of it. Secondly, and I must hurry, putting Black religious music within a social historical context. So let's talk about it from a popular culture standpoint, but with historical popular culture. And what was popular at that particular time during times of enslavement were Negro spirituals, also known as the antebellum spirituals, so before the war, also known as Negro spirituals. Spiritual music, or African American spirituals, is a genre of Christian music that is purely and solely the creation of generations of African Americans, which merged African cultural heritage. That's the beat making. I'm going to tell you about the coming of judgment. Fare ye well, fare ye well. I'm going to tell you about the coming of judgment. Fare ye well, fare ye well. Great getting up morning. Fare ye well, fare ye well. In that great getting up morning. Fare ye well, fare ye well. Combination of beats. And of course, we know they used to communicate through drums. So that's very African. A syncopation of different beats happening at once. But they merged that African cultural heritage with the experiences of being held in bondage and slavery. We talked about that. The suffering, the dignity of suffering. And they say often, you have to go through something. And so this music that was shaped during the domestic slave trade. Spirituals encompass the sing songs, the work songs, the plantation songs that evolved into blues and gospel today. In the church and even hip hop, there are connections with the spirituals, with hip hop, jazz, etc., and so forth, even rock. Referred to all these subcategories are referred to as folk songs. While they were often rooted in biblical stories, they also describe the extreme hardship endured by African Americans who were enslaved from the 17th century until the 1860s. The emancipation altering mainly the nature, but not continuation of slavery for many. Many new derivatives of music genres emerged from the spiritual songcraft. So that's a little bit of history. Prior to the end of the U.S. Civil War, emancipation, spirituals were originally an oral tradition, which is very African also, passed from one slave generation to the next. Biblical stories were memorized, then translated into songs. Following emancipation, the lyrics of spirituals were published in printed form. Fisk Jubilee singers popularized the spirituals, established in 1871. You can go to Fisk University today in Nashville, and see a lot of the history there. They popularized spirituals. Let's transition. I talk also modern spirituals as well. The civil rights sometimes will often take songs and spirituals and change them for the cause of the movement. Okay, and I'm going to talk about her quote in a second. So, for example, one song was the traditional way. Woke up this morning with my mind stay on Jesus. I woke up this morning with my mind stay on the Lord. Woke up this morning with my mind stay on Jesus. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. And then during the civil rights, woke up this morning with my mind stay on freedom. And so they co-opted it in a good way. They adapted it to the movement. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. And Mahalia Jackson, nobody did it better. Dr. King, her life is fascinating. Dr. King would often call her when he got ready to do a march. And the song went hand in hand. The songs went hand in hand during the civil rights movement. She says, "Do you know most of the Jewish songs have the same trend of sadness as Negro spirituals?" And the reason I wanted to include that quote is because traditionally, African Americans, especially enslaved Africans, always identified with Old Testament narratives, with the Jewish experience for obvious reasons, the enslavement of the Jewish people in the Old Testament, but they identified with the characters in the Bible, like they called, as you know, Harriet Tubman was Moses, the enslaver, the slave master was Pharaoh, and African Americans was Israel. And so a lot of the writings and the songs reflect that. And so that's what this quote reminds me of. There's no American social movement of the 20th or 21st century more closely connected to music than the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Protesters, some in prison, sang freedom songs to keep their spirits up. Folk singers, black and white alike, wrote songs about the paradoxes and pains, not just of Jim Crow, the Jim Crow South, but of the racism that had long troubled American life. So once again, in the new era, after emancipation in 1865, because let me just offer a little history. I'm going to jump back here. 1863, with the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves in the states that were under rebellion. So, for example, Kentucky was a slave state, which is I live right by Kentucky. As I mentioned, my church is about 12 to 15 minutes from Kentucky, and where my university is. And slavery was legal in Kentucky, but Kentucky never seceded. But it was one of those border states, the slave state, and so legally they could keep their slaves. But those individuals that were under rebellion, like Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, those slaves were free according to 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. But nobody was really free until 1865, with first the passing of the 13th Amendment that made slavery illegal unless you were incarcerated. And then the 14th Amendment, which gave black males citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which was enfranchisement. But after that, so enslaved people, music and performance was a part of life that got us through. And you see the same thing in the Jim Crow era and discrimination of the civil rights movement, during the lynchings and the rapings and the church burnings, etc. and so forth. These are some points I want to add. The role of music we should think about during the civil rights movement and now. The role of music as a motivating force in the civil rights movement cannot be overstated. As I said, as teachers, and when we teach history, when we impart this to individuals, we should think about the role of music. Students of U.S. history must appreciate the central importance of music in the civil rights movement. Now, I want to say this: African American history is American history. It should be relegated to the corners. There's legislation. There's all the critical race theory legislation. I do a lot of writing and speaking and teaching on critical race theory. This new legislation is trying to stamp out the teaching of African American history in our schools, the teaching of a more diverse curriculum, multicultural curriculum. And the politicians are going after the truth, and they want to squelch it because they wanted to hide it. And those that forget their history are destined to repeat it. And so we must remember that this is American history as well. The popular song, thirdly here, the popular songs of different musical genres reflected the values and beliefs of the civil rights movement. The music was effective in spreading the message of the civil rights movement. Just looking at contemporary times, it's undeniable the role that I would say Black spirituality plays in popular culture, but Black religious music in particular. Snoop Dogg's album, he made a gospel album. If you have not heard it, it's actually pretty good. And he aligns himself with traditional gospel artists. He says unapologetically, I grew up in the Black church. And he's on, you can, now that I say it, you can Google the interviews and it's really, really good. I was surprised. I let my children listen to it. They liked it. They liked it, my teenagers. And Chance the Rapper, he always is collaborating with gospel choirs and embracing that aspect of our history because they get it. Nick Cannon, he was doing something with the Clark sisters recently, and Kiara Shear, which is the Clark sisters' daughter. You don't know what the Clark sisters are? They're a famous gospel group. Famous, really, one of the most famous female groups of all times. Really, they've gotten all kinds of awards, and it's becoming more mainstream. And so check out He's Blessing Me Again. That's the name. He did Snoop Dogg did a song with the late Rance Allen. And it's really well done. That's all I have to say. That's my favorite one. So we see the influence of this kind of music today. Let me begin to wrap up here. Black religious music in modern popular culture. In modern times, Black gospel choirs are used in hip-hop songs to take audiences, quote unquote, to church. Although I don't really like that expression because it frames it as sort of a la carte. We're going to take y'all to church momentarily, then get back to what we're doing. But in the Black experience, church involves food. This is part of my other research. Church involves fellowship. It involves fictive kin. We have aunts and uncles and cousins and brothers that you're not biologically related to, but you still are family. And all the trappings of a family, the good, the bad, and the ugly. You know, I'm not going to sit up here and deny some of the dysfunctionality of the Black church, but it's an institution. In fact, the early schools in the South, when it was illegal to, the food led to diabetes, thank you. That's still happening. Fried chicken, grits, catfish, etc. and so forth. That's a whole nother conversation in terms of the health of our church, the health of the Black community. And so the early schools, when it was illegal for African Americans to have an education, in fact, in some instances, in Mississippi, there were specific laws against teaching Negroes. And if you were caught with a book, sometimes they would have their hand cut off because they understood once African Americans became educated, they would be like Frederick Douglass. They would cease to be a slave and figure out a way to usurp the authority of the enslaver. So the Black church played a great role. Comedians like Tyler Perry commonly use a Black church discourse and narrative in their material with the Medea character. Black situation comedies reference preachers and Black church culture in a matter-of-fact way. There's a Martin Lawrence episode, one of my favorite Martin Lawrence episodes, where Tommy, I can't remember Tommy's real name, but he passed recently, and they go into an impromptu church service where Tommy is preaching, and then they go into the whole traditional Negro spiritual, Old Man River, and still a part of everyday aspects of what it means to be an African American and all its complexities. This is just one aspect of Black culture. I'm very careful about that as well because it's complex. This may not be everybody's experience, but there's enough people that share this experience where we can call it an authentic Black experience. Even former President Obama uses the rhetorical style of the Black preacher when giving speeches. The repetitiveness to revisit a theme over and over again is a rhetorical device that Black preachers have used for a long time. Like I Have a Dream is a perfect example. When you get to the close, the end of I Have a Dream speech, it becomes very repetitive. The Black church is a part of the intellectual history. The music is a part of the intellectual history. And Cornel West said that if we want to take Black studies seriously, we want to take African American history seriously, we must look at the role that the Black church played, and in that same way, the role that music has played. And as I mentioned, music often in the Black experience is not always a performance. It's an ontology. I want to restate that. It's an existence. And like growing up with my brothers and sisters, our birthday song was Little Boy, How Old Are You? Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Said she's only 21 years old. We grew up, that was our birthday song. Little boy grew till he got old, taught me how to live right and wrong. When the little boy began to remember, said he was born on the 25th of December. Little boy, how old are you? Call and response. Traditional spiritual. I don't really know where we got it from. Somebody at church, maybe my dad. And it was a part of our culture. And that was, we were outside singing that, playing. One of the most popular songs is We Shall Overcome. And we all know this song. And it's so interesting when we hear the when we hear about the civil rights movement, songs are evoked in our head because it's synonymous. And so I like to say the past is having a conversation with the present. The past is having a conversation with the present. And in our history, there's music in the air. There is singing, there is dancing that has been translated throughout the decades and the centuries. And we have it today. One way that we live and breathe history is by song. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Then I like this part. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. we shall overcome someday. These are some references. There's a book called Self-Taught. It talks about African American education, souls of Black folks up from slavery. I threw in this book Critical Race Theory because that's been a popular topic. The Narrative of Life of Frederick Douglass. So I'll be happy to send you a copy of my notes if need be. Questions or thoughts or comments?
This was a terrific presentation. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you so much. My pleasure.
It's the most powerful presentation I've ever seen in this academic conference. Thank you very much. And actually I came in late. I really wanted to listen to this presentation, but actually there was a hurricane and the campus was closed, so I had to move. yeah. But
wow.
I'm glad. Yeah, I'm glad that you are doing longer than I expected. Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. Yeah. And also, just a comment, just information. I'm from Japan. I have a very different cultural background. But just your information, those religious songs, Christian songs are very powerful, even in my country, Japan. And probably Japan is not really Christian countries. Yeah. But still, those Christian music is very. Some of those Christian music, Christian songs are very popular. For example, Amazing Grace, it's something everybody knows, even in my country. Yeah, some of those Christian songs are very, very well known in my country, even in non-Christian countries. Yeah, so that's also I can kind of feel this power of music. It just doesn't matter where you were born, what culture background you have. It can really influence everybody. Yes. And also, I'm a teacher. I'm an assistant professor at Alabama A&M University, which is a historically Black university. In a graduation ceremony, always this chorus group, A&M chorus group, sing. It's just so beautiful, just something I can feel from you African American singers. I can't explain very well, but there's something special, I think. Yeah. So I kind of appreciate if you can explain to me, just what's this something special from this African American people. Their voice is so special. Where does it come from? How it's originated. I know it's not really easy question, but that's kind of if you can tell me something, I appreciate. Yeah.
And that is a big question. We could do another presentation on that. I'll try to give a couple of thoughts on it. First of all, Amazing Grace is a spiritual. There's a whole history behind that. A slave captain heard African Americans humming, and they use minor chords too. They use chords that are minor, that are melancholy, and he put words to that. And then when the enslaver, he was converted to Christianity. He wrote that song. He took those slave melodies and added words to it. I once was lost, but now found. Was blind, but now I see. But to answer your question, in the Western mind, I look at epistemology, the study of knowledge. I don't always use Western constructs. There's parts of knowledge that we can't explain that are otherworldly, and that's what comes about in the song. And Roboto said it. It was shaped in suffering. That's why it's so authentic. And often it's not a performance. It's self-expression. And when music is done authentically and from a place of self-expression and emotion and spirituality, that's when it's done best. That's what soul music is all about. So it's otherworldly. That's why you can't really put words on it. And you can find it in other cultures. You're right. You can find it in Native American cultures. You can find it in bluegrass. But African Americans, we had our a double dose of suffering in history, which shaped our self-expression. So that gets at it there. Thank you for your comments.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for the. Yeah. Thank you for your answer. Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. Thanks.
Yes.
I had a question, Dr. Childs.
Go
Hello?
ahead.
Oh.
I can hear you.
I thoroughly enjoyed your incorporation of song, by the way. And I thought our family was doing something by using the Stevie Wonder version of we were doing something. So now I realize, okay, own song. I love it. I love it.
And Dr. Davis, it's a whole thing. It's like we probably sing for 20 minutes. It's a whole, we add verses to it. It's a whole experience.
That is beautiful. That's a beautiful tradition. But in addition to that, I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, let's see, he just spoke. I don't see his name anymore. But oh, there you are, Mr. Koji.
Yes.
Yes. He just mentioned how he heard and learned about Amazing Grace and gospel music in his country. And my question to you is, what role do you think popular artists such as how Aretha Franklin, her gospel song was, her gospel album was very widely well known, right? And I'm wondering, what role do you think she's somewhat early, but artists such as Aretha Franklin what role do you think they've played in actually making American gospel music, Black gospel music global?
Global, yeah. Actually, Dr. Davis, that's an amazing question. Just like anywhere else, Black artists in general were more accepted internationally than they were in the States. Like Jimi Hendrix, for example. He was super popular in Europe before he got popular in the United States because of the legacy of Jim Crow and racism. And so it's the other way around, really. I remember I went to Mexico City. I took students there, and I stayed with a young family, so my host brother, and they listened to African American blues. Those Mexican children, that young people that didn't even listen to, that could barely speak English, but they listened to Muddy Waters. They listened to jazz, old jazz, BB King, and so people have always accepted our music better outside of the U.S. But to your question, also, Aretha Franklin and even Mahalia Jackson, they packed out audiences internationally, and when people saw that they were accepted abroad, then Americans were like, "Oh, okay, Jimi Hendrix made it in you can say about all Black genre. He made it in Europe, so I guess we'll accept him now." But I love speaking to Mr. Koji's point and both of your point. Watch footage. That's another thing I do. I analyze in my classroom and in my research. I analyze footage of these old. Now we have access to everything on YouTube, which is amazing. Watch Mahalia Jackson's concerts. People would be in tears. It was so moving and emotional. All of the pain of Black bodies being lynched and the fear and not being able to get a job and Black women being hit on by their bosses, the white bosses, and all of the legacy of racism would just come out in her singing. He'd say, "We are not afraid." That was a bold statement too. "We are not afraid today. Deep in my heart." You have to sing it like that. "I do believe We shall overcome someday. But the international aspect of it made Americans accept them. And even today, though you're insightful, those individuals were trailblazers in taking it to the world.
Just additional information, the jazz, you know, as far as I know, that's the most appreciated music in the world among the intellectuals.
Yeah.
You know, even my father, I mean, he's a literature, he teaches Japanese literature. You know, he's a very, very conservative guy. But even my father was so fascinated by this jazz. You know, it's so international. It's something, I don't know, it's something beyond the logic. You are African American music. Yeah. So,
Yep.
I don't know why they are so loved by those intellectuals, you know, but that's true, you know. Somehow your music is so international, you know, type of music that can attract everybody in the world.
Right.
Can I chime in here? This is Alberta Yeboah Owofasa, and from my name you can tell that I'm an African, and I'm all smiles listening to the conversation going on, because this presentation is so beautiful. It's
thank you.
So touching. It's so moving. I got goosebumps as I listened to the presentation, and I'm getting goosebumps because, of course, you're talking about the African heritage. Yes, it's African American history, but it's the African heritage. And I want to speak a little to what Dr. Koji Nishida is saying, that he's in Japan and the music from this part of African American music is appreciated in Japan. Actually, I grew up in the 60s, and I grew up with the music of Aretha Franklin in those days.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as somebody else asked, how was this music made so global, and how does it touch the human being, the soul, so well? And I think you hit the nail on the head, Dr. Charles, when you said that when you've been through suffering and you're expressing suffering in music, it comes from the depths of your soul, from the depths of your spirit. And when that happens, you know, everybody can relate, because suffering is a human experience. And when you hear music that is expressed from the depths of the soul, of the spirit, in any part of the world, Dr. Ishida, it is appreciated because it comes from the human experience, from the humanity of the individual. And so, you know, I wanted to speak to that as well, that yes, it is African American music, but it is global because it speaks to the human experience, which is the global human experience, speaks to the human condition of suffering. Everybody on the face of this earth has experienced suffering in some way or the other. So when you hear somebody express that in song, it's a beautiful, relatable experience. So no matter your culture around the world, you tend to appreciate that. So thank you so much. This is a beautiful, beautiful presentation. And I'm a social studies professor too.
Yay.
So I was thinking, how can I incorporate some of the music into some of the lessons that I teach my students? And it so happens that by God's grace, I sing also. I'm not a professional singer, but I sing also. So I'm thinking of how to adopt your style of teaching in my classroom. So I look forward to doing something like that.
Well, what university are you at?
I'm at Jackson State University.
Jackson State.
Jackson, Mississippi.
All right, we should collaborate. My contact information is in the chat. Can you send me an email? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, before we run out of time, I want to, Dr. Amos put a question in the chat too. So, and she asks, is there a BLM Black Lives Matter song that characterizes the protest movement?
I would say there's a genre, which is hip hop has been one of those genres that had the hip hop culture seems to go with Black Lives Matter movement, but you don't see the music as integrated in the same way that you saw it in the civil rights movement. But I think there's an untapped resource. I think hip hop gets mischaracterized. That's something else I write about. People focus on the misogynistic aspects of hip hop and the drug culture, but there's a whole genre of hip hop, a whole category that's socially conscious. People like Kendrick Lamar and J. Cole, and these individuals are adopting Black Lives Matter. Like even what Colin Kaepernick, he's an athlete, but that whole spirit of what he was trying to do, I think, is embodied in hip hop. So that would be my response. But there's not a specific song. There can be though.
Well, that's great. Well, we've come to the end of our hour. Thank you so much, Dr. Childs, for your presentation. It was certainly enjoyed by everyone. We appreciate that. And I just want to remind everybody that we have a full slate of presentations tomorrow. Tomorrow's the last day. Please, please, please attend these sessions. Your speakers and presenters have worked hard to put their work together, and it is just and right that we go and attend their sessions and hear what they have to say. And then just to remind everybody that as we close out of this conference, we're looking forward to planning next year's conference, which will be, I don't have the dates in front of me, around the same week, but we plan to be in Dallas in person. So keep an eye out for that information. Will be coming forward soon. And I want to thank everybody for attending today.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Dr. Davis, where are you at? What school did you say you're at again?
St. Louis University and St. Louis.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. You were inspiring.
Very inspiring. Thank you.
I cannot say I'm gonna be like the other doctor and start singing in my classes. I won't say that. You were inspiring.
All right. Thank y'all so much. This was a treat. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.